Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us in the Department of Fine Arts and Art History for this talk by Duygu Demir that has been graciously sponsored by the Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan Chair for Arabic and Islamic Studies and the Center for Arts and Humanities here at AUB. Duygu Demir is an art historian and curator with a PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, focused on articulations of modern painting from Turkey. Before pursuing her graduate studies, she worked as a programmer at SALT in Istanbul. In addition to SALT, working at SALT in addition to SALT in Istanbul and Ankara, her exhibition projects have been presented at MIT's Keller Gallery in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Sorry, the problem with reading from the phone is sometimes your phone does strange things. Okay. In addition to SALT in Ankara and Istanbul, her exhibition projects have been presented at MIT's Keller Gallery in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Arthur Space for Arts in Istanbul, and Tate Modern London. She writes articles and reviews on contemporary art for magazines and online platforms in Turkey and abroad, alongside her academic research. Demir's research interests include exhibition histories, transnational encounters, and moments of confluence between art and architecture, as well as contemporary artistic practice, particularly of the non-Western kind. She holds a combined BA in visual art and art history from Columbia University in New York. Join me in welcoming Duygu Demir.
Thank you. Thank you, Salim, and the department for this kind invitation and for having me here. I met Salim a few months ago at NYU Abu Dhabi, where I was working as the curator of the art gallery and also as research assistant professor, and I realized Salim was probably one of the only 5 people who, not knowing me, knew about my dissertation, which was very touching. And thank you for the invitation today. And basically what I'm going to try to do is one chapter of my dissertation, which I'm now working towards a manuscript. I'm going to talk specifically about the chapter that focuses on the copy, but first I want to give you a larger sense of my project. So the first part will be about the 2 generations of painters that I look at, and then we'll move on to the specific topic of today. Okay, and then I'm going to read, of course. And if I'm not loud enough, tell me. Okay, I think it's also because of the elections. Okay. Today I'm going to focus on what I call the culture of the copy, which I argue is prevalent in the artistic practices of the late Ottoman and early Turkish painters I study. However, before I get into that, I'd like to give you a sense of my larger project, and I'd like to start with a pairing that acted as a visual antithesis for me when I started researching and writing about Turkish modernism some years ago. On the left is an example of 16th century Kufi calligraphy spelling Allah, God, from an album at the Topkapı Palace collection in Istanbul. On the right is a more easily recognizable image, Mondrian's well-known oil painting Broadway Boogie Woogie from the early 1940s. This pairing accompanies the foreword to one of the few English language books on Turkish painting. The juxtaposition is of course meant as a visual provocation. However, it also signals a desire on the part of the editors to claim for the Turks precursory modernism that anticipated Mondrian's neoclassicism, or at least to suggest a kinship between Islamic calligraphy and 20th century Western abstraction. Even though they were made 400 years apart, the square shape, the predominant use of primary colors, the angular lines that organize the composition, both suggest an undeniable visual affinity between the two. These formal similarities are further amplified with the transference of the 2 works onto the printed page, erasing all evidence of their physical differences and collapsing all that set the 2 non-representational traditions apart in terms of medium, format, material, and scale. While the book that this pairing comes from was published in the late 80s, similar arguments have long been employed by Turkish critics and artists, as well as foreign interlocutors since the 1950s. These well-intended but wildly inaccurate postulations depart from the idea that since neither Islamic geometricism in architectural decoration nor miniature art employ the Western perspectival system, they could be seen as germs of the modern. My project, which is titled as Syncretic Modernism, argues the exact opposite. Rather than succumbing to the desire for Turks for having already been modern, or in the least suggesting a smooth or natural transition into the Western tradition of representation, I look at how Turkish painters learn to speak the language of easel painting, the ultimate lingua franca they aspire to communicate through. I argue that while fully voluntary, the partaking of Turkish artists in Western modernism was far from a smooth transition suggested by this juxtaposition. And while doing this, as much as highlighting the more fluent and effortless instances of speaking the language of oil painting that these artists eagerly adopted, I also embraced the mispronunciations, the direct translations, the awkward appropriations, and the envious emulations. Additionally, I look at these paintings as a series of negotiations and contextualizations that evince larger societal and cultural transformations. I'll just give you a few examples. I won't go through all of the paintings, but in this larger project, I focus on two generations of painters who were active during the 30-year period between the 1910 and 1940s that I focus on. The first is a group of Muslim Turkish Ottoman painters who graduated from the School of Fine Arts in Istanbul that was founded by Osman Hamdi in the late 19th century. They were the first students to be sent to Paris with financial support from the Ottoman government, where they initially attended the independent preparatory ateliers at the Académie Julian, followed by studies at the École des Beaux-Arts. These painters are often referred to as the 1914 generation, as their return to Istanbul was instigated by the First World War. They're also often referred to as the Turkish Impressionists, as their time in Paris resulted in a recognizable stylistic departure from their academic training in Istanbul, with a loosening in their brush strokes and the embrace of a lighter color palette associated with French Impressionism. So basically, I'm showing you the studies that they made in Istanbul, which are much sharper images, and then some of the studies that they made in Paris. And you can see the transformation in this like more painterly attitude. Their return to Istanbul in the beginning of the war overlapped with the departure of many European, Levantine, and other Christian communities from the empire, who had until then formed the majority group in the artistic sphere. Thus, the 1914 generation painters were quick to find employment as art instructors and high-ranking bureaucrats, which they gladly took on, gradually forming a Muslim Turkish and predominantly male hegemony in the art world. While the project focuses on the dominant figures, it does acknowledge absence. I actually, in the dissertation, talk about the absence of certain figures from this group portrait. And those include somebody like Panos Terlemezyan, who left the empire, came back when Istanbul was occupied in the early 20s for a while, but then left again. There's also Eleni Iliadis, who was a student, and then she was during the population exchanges, she went to Athens, and this is a painting that she exhibited in Athens, but it is of Istanbul. Or other omissions like Mihri Müşfik, who's a Muslim woman painter who was the head of the Women's Fine Arts Academy, but somehow she left that position, and even though she returned to Turkey afterwards, those positions were occupied basically by all these men. So she moves to the United States later. There's a scholar who's amazing, who has traced her presence in the United States. So I just wanted to make this parenthesis that even though I speak about the dominant male and their works, I also acknowledge the absence in the project. What's not seen or depicted in the works of the 19th generation is the privileged access of their makers that allowed them to continue to register these scenes on canvas beyond the empire. In its switch from its Ottoman beginnings to a decidedly Turkish painterly attitude, their work took on qualities of the patriarchal nation-state. Their chosen style, a painterly naturalism, or dubbed Turkish Impressionism, testifies to this. Impressionism's main tenet of capturing light in a specific place at a specific time implies access to place. For painters of minority millet, that place fell outside the purview of the newly formed nation-state. For Muslim women, it meant exclusion from public space beyond accepted limits of sociability. While the absences are not seen, they're still registered in these pictures. Even though Turkish Impressionism was quickly embraced by the intelligentsia, and the annual salons they organized were met with laudatory reviews and encouraging patronage, it took the Muslim Turkish audiences some time to become exhibition goers. And these are some of the clippings from newspapers that characterize the reaction of the Muslim public. The second group of painters I look at are the first students of the 1914 generation. Their first exhibition roughly matches the foundation of the Turkish Republic, and that's why I refer to them as the first children of the Republic. With the new nation's accelerated efforts to modernize and westernize over the course of the... Sorry, I'm late with my slides. These are the children of the Republic. And this is them returning back from Paris, and they're aboard this ship that brought them back. With the new nation's accelerated efforts to modernize and westernize over the course of the late 1920s and early 30s, these artists joined hundreds of other young students who were sent to Europe to study the latest developments in science, engineering, and the arts. Of course, they were tasked with bringing the knowledge they acquired in the West back to their homeland. Unlike their predecessors, this generation found the official European institutions lacking and preferred various independent ateliers in France and Germany. So this generation never went to the École des Beaux-Arts. There, they were enamored by newer modes of painting than prevalent in the continent, and especially the large shadows cast by Cézanne and Cubism on their European teachers. They came back to Turkey as young and ambitious artists ready to challenge their professors. They claimed a vanguardist position, protested the old ways of their Istanbul teachers and the artistic establishment, and formed independent groups. Instead of participating in the official salons, they organized exhibitions in stores, bars, and theater foyers where they shocked the audiences who had only been recently eased into easel painting with works that willingly departed from verisimilitude. They were subjected to similar predicated categorizations. Just as they accused their teachers for having dragged the beard of Impressionism to Turkey, this is a direct quote, having dragged the beard of Impressionism. The first children of the Republic were later labeled as Turkish Cubists and Constructivists by local theorists and historians. My study of these two generations spans a 40-year period, and surely these were eventful few decades, to say the least. So a very quick summary, even though I know that most people here are familiar with that history. It starts with the introduction of constitutional rule for the second time in the Ottoman Empire, marking the political rise to power of the Young Turks, which ended the oppressive rule of Abdülhamit II. The same period was also shaped by accelerated efforts of westernization as well as internal political strife, caused to some extent by the rise of nationalism and the consequential loss of territory for the Ottoman Empire. This was, of course, followed by the First World War, which resulted in great devastation and triggered significant demographic and political transformations in the region, the ramifications of which are still being felt today, to put it lightly. When the Ottoman Empire was defeated in the war, its territories were largely broken up and its capital Istanbul was occupied by French, Italian, and British troops. The late aughts and the early 20s saw the emergence of the Turkish nationalist movement in Anatolia, resulting in the Turkish War of Independence and the official end of the empire, followed by the foundation of the Turkish Republic in 1923. In the decade that followed, the early Turkish Republic began to find its footing as a new nation largely located in Asia Minor, with some territory in Thrace, including Istanbul. The top-down revolutionary reformism during this time aimed at full societal transformation. Turkey drastically severed its ties with the Ottoman imperial past through state-enforced reforms, which aimed at molding the new citizens of a secular, modern, and Western country. The caliphate was abolished, a Western dress code was introduced, the country switched from the Islamic calendar to the Gregorian one. The script reform replaced the Arabic script with the Latin alphabet. A few years later, words deemed foreign to Turkish were purged. These changes in political, legal, cultural, social, and economic policy make Turkey's fast transformation comparable to other revolutionary movements with totalitarian tendencies happening across the world in the 1930s. As for Turkish painting, drastic events such as these not only shaped the lives of the artists, but also made their mark on their works. In my project, I look at the paintings they made also as repositories of these drastic changes, which transformed the world of their makers. So I posit that a new term is needed for thinking about and understanding the modernism these artists came to produce, and that word is syncretic. Epistemologically, syncretism comes from Plutarch's Crete, where distinct Cretan communities came together to face a common enemy, despite their differences. The ideology behind Turkish nationalism called for synthesis. Turkish identity was to be formed by a synthesis of Turkish culture, Islamic community, and Western civilization. The need for synthesizing disparate elements such as these was not only a political goal that was aimed at uniting the country at large, but also an aesthetic challenge for the artists. Turkish cultural sources often repeat the word sentez as the ultimate solution to finding a mode of art making that would allow Turkish art to fully realize itself. Both in their paintings and in their writings, Turkish cultural producers tirelessly tried to achieve a synthesis between the East and the West to find the prevalent formula for a truly national, modern, and authentic art. Calling back the term to the vicinity of its birthplace, I use syncretic modernism to designate a set of aesthetic and intellectual negotiations these artists and intellectuals went through, starting with the late Ottoman Empire and extending to the early years of the Republic. While the goal was synthesis, a smooth combination of two simpler things for a more complex compound, I argue that the outcomes remained much more syncretic than synthetic. Okay, this was part one. Part two. What I'm presenting today, the culture of the copy, locates Ottoman and Turkish painting in a mimetic episteme. My argument here is that understanding this mimetic episteme is crucial to understanding syncretic modernism. I simply argue that with the entrance of the Western modality of oil painting into the Ottoman Empire came the culture of the copy. This is a framework that both normalizes imitation and looks at its varied results departing from the original that can be characterized as emulations, homage, facsimiles, appropriations, translations, and assimilations as modes of a necessary strategy of mimicry in syncretic modernism. It intertwines three stories as they relate to the copy. Through the interviewing of these three moments, mimicry becomes part of Turkish syncretic modernism's pedagogic narrative, as well as the emergence of an internalized modernist ethos, signaling its striving for originality. Going against the grain, I attempt to blur the line between imitation and invention, aiming for a reconsideration of narratives of modernism and their stake and investments in originality. But first we have to... Are you with me? Yes? Okay. But first we have to rewind slightly to the mid-19th century so that I can tell you what I mean by the culture of the copy and oil painting entering the Ottoman Empire at the same time. In 1980, Turkish art historian Sezer Tansu published an article in which he shared a recent discovery. Some of the earliest known Ottoman painters, loosely grouped under the umbrella term Türk primitifleri, Turkish primitives, had not worked from nature en plein air as assumed, but had instead based their paintings on photographs. These eerily placid landscapes, devoid of figures, were made by painters who came from military backgrounds. They're often called asker ressamlar, meaning soldier painters. The notion of landscape and linear perspective entered the vocabulary of Ottoman artists through military education, and more specifically through classes offered in these institutions aimed at training military personnel, as well as engineer architects in perspective. These art classes on offer were part of a modernized and westernized curriculum taught by European experts, and were offered for the making of topographic layouts, technical drawings, and engravings. They were not aimed at producing artists who could express themselves through the act of painting. There were classes dedicated to teaching the techniques of oil painting, but these classes were based on copying from already two-dimensional work, such as photographs and European prints. Some of the military personnel who trained at these schools also made paintings of and for the palace, often unsigned or signed by your faithful servant. Rather than landscape paintings in the Western tradition, expressive, romantic, or idealized, implying the subject position of a beholder, these were, and I'm now quoting Wendy Shaw, who has written about them, paintings or photographs of land that had been landscaped. In other words, these landscape paintings, which were often devoid of the human figure as they least offended Muslim sensibilities, can be seen as exercises in the newly adopted Western modality, through which modernity could be both displayed and performed. Translated from the two-dimensional plane of the photographic paper onto canvas, they were representations of representations. In other words, they were copies. Hence my argument that with painting in the Western modality in the Ottoman Empire came the culture of the copy. These oddly glossy, enlarged color renditions of photographs, taken to be the first examples of Turkish painting, were manual reproductions of technologically induced recordings of light on a chemically treated surface. They were not straightforward, simple copies. The Ottoman works were not made by students copying a master, as it will be in a European example, but they were made as proof of the artistic dexterity of their makers. They were not replicas made for easier dissemination or for commercial interests, but they did translate an image from one medium to another. The unwieldy nature of these Ottoman paintings that resist the definitions of the copy testify to the epistemic difference one has to keep in mind while looking at this particular history. Today, having internalized the modernist quest for originality, copy has become a primarily derogatory term, signifying not only the loser in a chronological race, but also a morally corrupt double. As much as resisting the modernist scorn for the copy, I also invite you to reconsider the notion of the original from that established by ideologies of the avant-garde. Seen in a different light, a copy can also be an original. As I will try to show you in this presentation, in the context of the late Ottoman Empire and the early Turkish Republic, the culture of the copy refers not simply to a manual imitative act or a secondary production, but to a mode of assimilation that informs the syncretic modernism of the painters of the early Turkish Republic. Now we're jumping to the 1950s. On July 25th, 1951, one of the main daily newspapers in Turkey announced an artistic scandal from its first page. The headline read, "Young painters are accusing famous artists of being copyists." A group of new graduates from the Art Academy were accusing certain older and well-established painters with plagiarism. Printed with the article on the front page was a juxtaposition between French painter Luc Albert Moreau's 1914 painting, Le Red Aryan, and Turkish painter Nurul Akberk's 1933 Aviators. The compositional similarities were hard to miss, although the grainy black and white print of the newspaper didn't allow for granular comparison or a discernment of color use between the two artists. The pairing was sufficient for any layperson to delineate the striking degree of similarity between the two paintings, steering the reader to easily conclude that Berg's painting had been clearly modeled after Moreau's composition. Continuing on the fourth page of the newspaper, the rest of the article included another visual pairing, this time exposing compositional similarities between Delacroix's renewed Liberty Leading the People from 1830 and Zeki Faik Izer's 1933 painting Inkılap, which is Revolution. The article explained that this visual expose of Isar and Berk had been initially made through a pamphlet prepared by young abstractionist painters in response to the reproach of the older generation against their work. The pamphlet also informed the readers that the artists were hard at work on a whole album of similar juxtapositions. The young painters claimed that in Turkey, the work of foreign artists had been plagiarized by those who had no reservations about putting their own signature on their paintings, copied from the likes of Dufy, Marcel Gomer, André Lotz, Georges Rouault, Henri Matisse, as well as Moreau and Delacroix. The painters who were accused of copying, Berk and Isar, were public figures. They were well-respected painters, and both were professors at the Art Academy. They both hastily responded to the serious accusation the very next day in the pages of the same newspaper. Berk simply admitted, yes, these are copies. Artists are always under the influence of each other. I was under the influence of Moreau when I painted this composition. It's the only copy I've made in my life. I was asked to submit a painting to the state exhibition, so I quickly made this painting. But Berk argued also that the art of the copy is born out of mutual influence, that it's a conversation between artists of different generations. And he gave the example of Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe, intentionally blurring the lines. So he was, Berk, in his defense, was intentionally blurring the lines between inspiration, influence, and imitation. Isar, however, the other artist under the same accusation, the one with the Delacroix painting, was more adamant about the originality of his work and did not accept the label of copyist. He said, Delacroix's work, let me go to that. Delacroix's work demonstrates a street battle during the French Revolution. My work is a symbolic painting of the revolution. The only similarity between the two paintings is that they both represent the country through a female figure. Also, they both have a triangular composition. In my work, Atatürk points towards the path needed to be taken. In the front are the toppled sultanate and reactionism. With his other hand, Atatürk holds the youth, represented by a male and female university student. The child on top of the small rock is pointing to the 10th year of the Republic with his hand. Together with the youth is the military. The torch represents education. There's a woman who has been freed by discarding her hijab. The mass of the populace, behind them is the Ankara citadel. Behind that is the rising light. The painting printed in your newspaper is such a symbolic work of art. If I were to make the same painting today, while I would try my best to make an even better one, I would have made it the same way. So that was Isar's defense. The two paintings in question by Berk and Isar were both submissions to the İnkılap sergileri, exhibitions of the revolution, which were initiated on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of the Republic and took place annually between 1933 and 37. Then they become the annual state exhibitions. The aim of these large exhibitions was to commemorate the War of Liberation and the revolutions of the Republic. The mission of representing the revolutions of the new Turkish Republic often resulted in artists producing with a different mindset for these exhibitions than their own personal styles and chosen subject matter. For example, the same year he submitted the Moreau copy to the state exhibition, Berk was busy sweating out cubism in independently organized exhibitions, emulating his teachers, Fernand Léger and André Lotz. But in the exhibitions of the revolution, the state's patronage, numerous paintings will be acquired by the parliament and the ministries from these exhibitions, as well as the national framework resulted in artists taking up historical genre painting, which was a weighty challenge for Turkish painters without such an established artistic tradition. While this national pressure encouraged some to emulate the tropes of social realism, even if these were not their preferred modes or styles of artistic practice personally, others, like Isar and Berk, turned to French painters for inspiration, emulation, or copying. Isar's painting especially has been characterized by some art historians as an unself-conscious postmodernism, and his pastiche is somewhat pitifully excused, postulating that the needs of the nation and the imposition of patriotic expression barred painters from speaking in any other way. But when they did speak through copies such as these, the results are characterized as mistranslations, as paintings stripped from their original meaning and message. I, on the other hand, see Isar's awkward transcription of Delacroix's painting as precisely revelatory of the different dynamics in place in the Turkish Revolution as opposed to the French. Isar's quotational allegory reveals or even generates the precise Turkish Republic meanings in the deviations surfacing in the reapplication and rearrangement of original motives. Turkey was in fact not striving for democracy à la France, but would remain under the one-party system until 1946. The revolution was not a bottom-up insurgence, but a military uprising that resulted in the founding of a new republic, with the top-down imposition of a series of reforms that attempted to transform a dominantly rural, non-cohesive populace into a nation. By 1933, Mustafa Kemal was indeed a paternalistic, even godlike figure. Only a year later, after the surname law he initiated was passed, he would officially take the surname Ata, ancestor, Türk, that was ascribed to him by a law passed by the Turkish parliament. The reforms gave women equal rights, but the female figure remained tokenistic in society as well as in paintings for years to come. If Isar's borrowing is to be seen as a document, it's not an unself-conscious and fully anachronistic postmodernism, but a conscious decision to mimic the lingua franca, to learn it. The unself-conscious can only be attributed to the slippages that are in effect the slippages of the transpositions of the ideals of French Revolution into the formation of the Kemalist regime. Isar's On the Road to Revolution is as reflective of the influence of Jacobin ideas on the Republican modernizers as it is of what got lost in translation in Turkey's societal reformation. This painting can almost be read as a critique of Turkey's modernization. While it looks parodic to the contemporary eye, as a document, it testifies to the bold attempts of artists who were searching for ways of expression in a borrowed language, a language that had to be borrowed if modernism was to be the goal. So what seems to be a lack of sophistication in these direct transpositions, their awkwardness today was far from legible in 1930s Turkey. Their messages, assumed to be reflective of the simple patriotic intentions of the artists who made them, were not as evident to the Turkish public at the time, even to the most sophisticated. An anecdote by artist and museum director Halil Dikmen about Atatürk's first visit to the Museum of Sculpture and Painting in 1937, which opened at his orders, testifies to this. Dikmen says that Atatürk was most interested in Isar's On the Road to Revolution and asked him to explain its subject matter. Dikmen, like Isar, had to describe to Atatürk its allegorical workings that are straightforward to viewers today. On the upper left corner of the painting is a group of people. This group represents the youth that is progressing in the direction you have pointed. On the right lower corner is a second group. This part shows how the reactionaries were quashed with your progressive move. Atatürk was very pleased with this explanation, and after standing in front of the painting for a while, he simply said, "Beautiful." I call the newspaper scandal in the mid-century a fabricated scandal because it's somewhere between 1933, when these paintings were made, and the mid-century, when these accusations began to find some traction, that the notion of the copy came to be sneered at. In fact, this very same disclosure had been made in a book titled Art and Society, published 9 years earlier by sociologist and theorist Hilmi Ziya Ülken. In the booklet, the author offered a brief history of Turkish painting as a narrative of not yet having found a true national art, which will coalesce in technique and subject matter, in other words, synthesize two disparate elements, once it matured. In the book, Berk and Isar are by no means his sole target, but only examples in a series of attempts of this unfolding maturity. This hopeful narrative of progress towards originality is echoed by other writers. One of whom said this as late as the 1950s. Lately, it's been said that our art has entered an era of creation. Empty words. We haven't yet properly understood Western art. How can we create something new in a sphere we don't understand? In my opinion, it's sufficient for us to reach Western artists through imitation for now. If creative imitators surface during this time, good for them. These viewpoints do not directly shun but tolerate the copy as a necessary step on the way towards originality. They assume a belated Turkish artist who is playing a game of catch-up. Rejecting this standpoint, I suggest a positive thesis of the culture of the copy, which treats copying as an entry point into the world conversation of modernism, that Turkey, as a modern nation-state with full support of painting as a significant, if not tokenistic, cultural output, needed to engage in. Sorry, again, I missed a slide here. This is the painting hanging in the museum when it was first installed. Part of what makes this scandal a matter of fabrication is precisely the suppression of the instances of the copy in the writing of a modernist European art history. Copying had been part of the French tradition since the early 17th century, when royal portraits were commissioned to be copied and distributed to various offices at the orders of Louis XIV. It was, of course, also a pedagogical tool, the entire system of the Beaux-Arts education being based on having the student copy, first by making drawings from reliefs and sculpture, followed by life classes, gradually ascending to copying from paintings. Moreover, since its establishment in 1666, the students at the Académie de Rome would make and send exact copies back to France. This way, not only did they engage closely with the work of an Italian master, but also helped expand the royal collections. Copying was also a form of veneration. To copy was to flatter. Established artists such as Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres continued to make copies from masters throughout their lives. Both academicists such as Ingres and moderns such as Delacroix also ensured their living costs by what they called répétition, repeating their own work with slight variations. By the 19th century, copying was institutionalized. The French state commissioned copies for town halls and churches, and the bourgeois collector acquired réduction, producing a new class of painters, professional copyists. If a copy was found inefficient, the state inspectors would have it perfected by another artist. These replica copies made by professional copyists as well as young students of the arts were not only commodities made on demand, but also increased the symbolic value of the artwork. The Louvre was so overrun by copyists that regulations had to be put in place. It was only by the mid-19th century that the exact copy slowly started to lose its primary place, and slight deviations as signals of personal temperament came to be appreciated. Tellingly, the Salon banned exhibiting copies in 1852. The expressive homage was another matter. By the turn of the century, copies that showed an understanding of the original but departed from it with an act of personal interpretation were on the rise, made by many modernists, including Cézanne, Van Gogh, and Matisse. Picasso's paraphrases decades later can be seen as a continuation of this type of homage copy. These were modern copies, and in the modern copy, the replica function was replaced by the author function. Faithful emulation was overtaken by the modernist regime of personality and originality. Neither strict copies nor overtly interpretive, Berk and Izard's adaptations occupy an awkward middle ground between a venerational exercise and the modern copy. Vaguely personalized, their copies adapted French originals to a strikingly different historical context. But was that not allowed? Should theirs be considered shameful copies? Or when did they lose their acceptability? In the early 30s, when modernism, to which these two artists were fully committed, did not offer a heroic visual rhetoric to depict national adherence for the artists, where should they have turned in order to depict Atatürk's reforms? At the time of the first exhibition of the paintings of revolution in 1933, Izard was only 28 years old. Berk was 27. They were young artists who had just returned to their country after studying in Paris. Like fellow artists, they participated in the celebrations of the first decade of the new republic by submitting paintings to the first state-organized exhibition. How best were they to express the revolutions of the new nation? Unsurprisingly, they turned to French masters for direction. But neither Berk nor Izard was artistically mature enough to have developed their own signature styles to do proper modernist homage. By the early 50s, influence had turned into an anxiety of influence for artists. In the 60s, the copy would become completely unacceptable, and I'll tell you why soon. With the part 3, this is the end. With the newspaper incident in 1951, Berk and Izar in fact fully internalized this 20th century scorn for the copy. This is evinced by another event that took place the same summer. As this fabricated scandal filled the pages of various newspapers over the next few months with other artists and writers chiming in, Izar and Berk tried to quickly suppress another skirmish concerning copies of paintings. Just 3 days after the newspaper Cumhuriyet made his name French front page news, Izar convened a council of teachers at the academy to overturn a decision about acquiring 2 copies of paintings made by female artist Maidem Arar for the collection of the Museum of Painting and Sculpture. Arar had spent the last 2 years in Paris on a state fellowship, studying at the independent atelier of André Lot. She had spent 3 precious months of her time in Paris fulfilling a commission by copying her teacher André Lot's La Moisson and Pablo Picasso's Les Casseroles Émaillées, both on view at the time at Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris. According to Arar, the director of the academy, Izar especially requested her to make copies during her stay in Paris and asked her to bring them back. By making a copy from her own teacher Lot, as well as another by an internationally recognized master, Arar was in fact participating in 2 different lineages of the copy, French and Ottoman. She was making a copy to understand the work of her teacher, much like the students in the studio of Ingres had done. She was analyzing Lot's Salon cubism through mimicry, and the influence of her teacher would be a defining factor of her own personal style. Secondly, she was providing an opportunity for the art students as well as the public in modern Turkey to see a work by a European master by offering its handmade replica. In fact, earlier that spring, a committee at the Fine Arts Academy, headed again by Izar, had convened and decided to purchase the 2 paintings presented to them by Arar, only to inform the artist in June that the school currently lacked sufficient funds to purchase the paintings. After Izar tried to annul the agreement to acquire the copies in July, stating that they were not in fact perfect, Arar proudly included the 2 copies she had made alongside 16 of her own geometricized landscapes, nudes, and still lifes in the exhibition that she opened together with her husband Şemsi Arar at the French consulate in Istanbul of the same year. The small brochure, which features on its cover her late Cubist still lives, that evinces her teacher Lot's heavy influence, lists the copies after Arar's own paintings. The copies also take pride of place in her brief biography as important achievements. And I'm quoting now. Maida Arar copied these paintings by 2 Western masters with full success and brought them to the homeland. After the rejection of her copies by Izar, Arar started a vehement campaign to have her copies purchased, as per the initial decision of the first committee. She wrote letters of complaint to the Ministry of Education, asked her fellow artists to testify to the adequateness of her copies, and requested her teacher Lot to certify her copy of this work, which he happily provided. So it became a certified copy as well. As both of Arar's copies are now part of the collection of the State Museum of Painting and Sculpture today, and the lot can be seen in the inventory in 1952, it can be safely inferred that her campaign eventually succeeded. The letter from her campaign also showed that Izar had recently bought other copies for the museum's collection and paid other artists handsomely. But why were these copies commissioned to the artists and acquired by the Academy for the museum in the first place? In fact, commissioning and collecting copies of paintings from the European canon was the continuation of a late Ottoman project initiated by Halil Eldem, Osman Hamdi Bey's brother. As the head of the school and the museum, Izar in 1951 was merely continuing a practice that had been in place for the last 40 years. The State Painting and Sculpture Museum was at its core a collection of copies. And I'll just briefly tell you how this came to be the case. After the passing of his brother Osman Hamdi in 1910, Halil Ethem soon after became the head of both the Imperial Museum and the School of Fine Arts. Both of these institutions had been founded by his brother, and Halil Ethem worked in the Imperial Museum alongside his brother for most of his life. The small gallery of copies of Western painting that he started in the Imperial Museum would eventually form the basis of Turkey's National Museum of Painting and Sculpture. One of Halil Ethem's Bey's first initiatives after becoming the director of the Imperial Museum and the school was to secure funding for starting a collection of paintings. He was soon granted a modest amount by the government. Instead of acquiring work of living artists, European or Ottoman, as per the wishes of artists in Istanbul for an Ottoman Luxembourg, as Talasso characterized it in 1906, or focusing on the work of Orientalist painters as hinted by his brother Osman Hamdi in the school's bylaws, Halil Ethem prioritized forming a collection of works by old masters with a small caveat. With budgetary concerns and scarcity of such works on the market, he suggested that priority should be given to form a collection of copies. Halil Ethem was not a painter like his brother Osman Hamdi, and as a museum professional with much closer ties to archaeology than to the fine arts, it's possible that he saw little difference between an original and a copy, much like the way archaeological artifacts were treated at the time, where plaster casts were just as significant to have in a collection, and large sums were being paid by museums with encyclopedic aspirations around the world for plaster cast copies at this time, even if debates about the superiority of the originals were ongoing. Moreover, the reproductions of paintings were shown in museums across Europe, even to the point of testing the abilities of the audience and daring them to tell the difference, more than a decade after Halil Ethem began forming his collection. In a sense, and I have a colleague from MIT who talks about this phenomenon in Germany, where the museum was really testing its audience to see if they could tell the difference between an original and a copy. In a case, Halil Ethem was no different than certain European curators who argued for bringing in absentia artworks into the imagination of the audiences through facsimiles. However, there was a notable difference. While visitors to museums in Europe could balance the reception of ideas from a copy with the material information from an original and assemble a holistic perception of the work of art in their minds, Ottoman audiences lacked the original to fill in the gaps. Halil Ethem wrote to museum directors in Berlin, Munich, Vienna, Paris, and Rome, asking to help him purchase copies of works from their collections. A close examination of the logbook that he kept for the collection of copies shows that he acquired copies of paintings from the 14th to the 19th century, casting a wide net to include examples of European painting ranging from Flemish landscape to French history painting, with what seems to be a particular focus on the human figure and especially portraiture. News of Ethem's efforts seems to have reached the young Ottoman artist in Paris when he visited the city in order to order more copies of paintings from the Louvre in person. The visit fueled passionate articles that appeared in the Ottoman Painters Society's journal, and his slight deviation from the course set by Osman Hamdi did not go unnoticed by the artists, revealing the young artist's ideas about the copy, the original, and photographic reproduction. Most found the initiative unfortunate, as they believed that the priority should lie with finding and presenting original works already in the empire, especially by Ottoman painters. They also complained about Halil Ethem's decision to look for copyists not among Ottoman artists and protested his preference for European copyists. Out of the 40 copies in the Asad-ı Nakşiye collection, 11 would be later commissioned to Ottoman artists. Among them was a female painter, Mihri Rasim, who would be the first director of the Women's Academy. I showed you an impressionist portrait by her earlier. Hüseyin Avni, whom we know as Avni Lifish today, had the biggest objection to the copies. He thought that Halil Bey had chosen a wrong path, and I'm now quoting Avni Lifish. If a painting museum is to be filled with copies, it's to the detriment of both the public and the painters. The public, as well as the novice painters, who are already devoid of the proper idea about what it is to be a painter, due to the inexistence of an artistic milieu, will either get the wrong idea or no idea at all about the fine arts if they're to base their opinion on these graceless, cold cadavers devoid of spirit. In fact, seeing a dead lion is not sufficient to understand what kind of animal a lion is. Despite the criticisms, Halil Ethem kept on collecting copies. And in 1915, the grand salon of the school and an adjacent room were rearranged for the display of this collection. When the collection was first presented at the school, the two rooms must have looked like the salons from any museum in Europe from a distance, except for the extremely condensed chronological and geographical presentation of a European history of art. I couldn't find photographs of this initial installation anywhere. I only was able to find the brochure. But if anybody comes across it, please let me know. The life of these galleries would in fact be very short. With the advancing of the war, the copies had to be eventually stored at the Imperial Museum, where they would remain from the occupation of the city until the foundation of the Turkish Republic. Nevertheless, Halil Ethem kept on collecting, this time adding to the inventory works by Ottoman artists that came from various palaces and homes in Istanbul. He must have written and printed the guidebook Elvah-ı Nakşiye in 1924, after the foundation of the Republic a year earlier, with the hopes of once again being able to show the growing collection, this time under the heading of a national museum, as his appeals to the new Turkish parliament to find a building for the museum was answered the same year. However, the copies would only resurface and be displayed publicly in 1937, when the State Painting and Sculpture Museum opened at the orders of Atatürk, with a room dedicated to the copies. The new director announced his plan to expand the collection economically, as well as investing in original examples of classical paintings by international masters. The museum would ask each student who was sent to Europe to bring back a copy they had made to the museum upon their return. With this idea, the new director had institutionalized the episteme of copying, essentially making it state-ordained. Epistemologically, this is in fact rather fitting. The adoption of this art form, the translation of the three-dimensional world onto the canvas, was itself a mimetic act for the Ottoman Empire, one part of a larger effort to modernize by imitating. The beginnings of painting that put the copy at the center of artistic practice informed a legacy of mimetic appropriation that continued on into the early years of the Turkish Republic. Whether Halil Ethem had the chance to visit the museum to see the traces of his own nucleus collection in the Painting and Sculpture Museum for the new nation is unknown, but unlikely. Unfortunately, the museum display would be short-lived once again, as it closed soon after its opening with the onset of the Second World War. The reopening of the museum must have been on Zeki Faik İzer's mind when, as the new director of the academy, he had encouraged Maide Arel to make copies while she was in Paris in 1950. Although it's not certain which copies were on view, the museum did reopen in 1951, and there was still a room for the copies. This room would disappear in the late 1960s with the rehang of the museum collection under the directorship of Nurullah Berk, the other painter who was accused. Interestingly, the copies came back on view just a few years ago when the museum reopened after extensive renovations after COVID. Within the context of the late Ottoman and early Turkish painting, the degree of separation between the aping copy, direct quotation, imitative pastiche, compositional borrowing, inadequate reproduction, or postmodern appropriation becomes harder to determine when the modernist concern for avant-garde originality in Western painting is put aside. Does the act of imitation always result in a copy? When is the original not copied but used only as a source image? This particular account of the culture of the copy puts to test the claim of Western civilization's universality, including modernism's impossible expectation of originality without precedent. In the act of the copy, the promise of both sides is doubly subverted. Neither the project of self-imposed assimilation nor the universal application of European culture and civilization is possible completely. However, for the artists that are subject of this study, it resulted in syncretic originals. Thank you.
take some questions, or Duygu will take some questions.
I know that was a lot. It's
I don't know the field at all. I don't know the field at all. But I wondered if you could say, I wondered if you could just say a few words about the status of the copy much earlier. So within Turkish art in the 17th century, was copying was something that people did to study, to learn.
when are we talking about?
Just earlier. So kind of before the late 19th and early 20th century kind of issues around modernism and originality.
You mean in
so
manuscript?
within Turkish art, sort of before that, 18th century.
Like manuscript painting?
Within the artistic world, I don't. So manuscripts, yes, but it could be any form of art. I guess I'm a bit curious about the status of the copy before the copy as the West. The kind of ideas about the copy and originality from the West started to bleed into.
I'm definitely not an expert in miniature painting, but I do know that within the miniature workshops, they also copied their master to learn. But again, like, because it's not a area of expertise for me, it goes way back in time that I don't feel comfortable completely answering that question. But I think it was more like a guild system in which the miniaturists were also learning by copying.
Interesting. Okay.
But I think that's the difference, is that originality was not sought after.
Thank you very much. You mentioned at one point that modernity had to be borrowed if it was going to be, I think that's how you put it, if it was going to be modern, it was going to have to be borrowed. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's a really big question. I think I say that not for modernity at large, but in the Turkish case, it had to be borrowed modernity. And I think they do that because for the Turkish intellectuals, since Tanzimat maybe, the idea of modernity is equal to westernizing. So they already make this equation from the get-go that requires imitation to be a part of it. I think that's the claim that I'm also internalizing.
I'm just interested, and I don't know, maybe you don't have an answer for that, but isn't that part of how cultures work? Like Romans copied ancient Greek sculptures, and Americans copied French and English art, and many cultures work like that. I wonder, what would you say about that?
Exactly.
Like, is this a episode of something that is actually happening on a wider scale?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's actually no original. Everybody's working with a precedent. But in Western narratives, there's a claim for originality, and there's also a claim for belatedness for the non-Western. I think what I'm trying to argue against is that you can't use this lens only on certain kinds of imitation or inspiration or copying, however you want to call it, because these words all come with a certain amount of judgment. Like for Picasso, we don't say he's imitating. We say he's quoting or he's making an homage. Whereas when we look at Turkish painting, we will say, oh, it's a copy or it's an emulation. We will not give them the agency of making an homage. I think that's where the judgment comes in, and I think that's exactly what I'm trying to work against, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely agree with that. And actually, you know, a lot of art that's been imported from other places, from Asia and Africa, and been appropriated and adopted by modernists, right?
Exactly.
So yeah,
I mean, modernism is not original in any
yeah.
way in that sense.
Just on this note, if I may abuse my privilege, I know you take the concept of syncretism from Turkish art writing itself, correct? but I wonder to what extent the kind of negative attitude towards the copy comes not only from modernism and, as you put it so eloquently, the impossible expectation for originality without precedent. It comes not only from modernism but also from post-colonial, early national expectations for difference,
Yes,
for authenticity.
exactly.
In which case, this isn't just a story about modernism, it's also a story about post-coloniality.
Yeah, I mean, because I'm looking at Turkish painters, I'm not using the word in that way, because I can't say Turkish painters are post-colonial.
But how would you, but that moment of kind of national, kind of self-construction?
Yeah, I think there's always this. I mean, I see so many similarities between like some of the Iraqi painters who are looking at Mesopotamian sculpture for a national identity, right? Like some of the earlier works that I showed, I didn't talk about them in detail, but something like this. This is a painter from one of the children of the Republic, and he also becomes a professor later. But before he's a professor, he works in the Anatolian Civilizations Museum in Ankara, and he looks at Hittite relief sculpture. And I think the claim that he's making to originality or to a national identity is to kind of take his modernist stroke, which he actually learns from Hoffman, because he studies under Hoffman, and their charcoal drawings are actually so similar. And then he combines that with this Hittite relief or Sumerian reliefs and calls it national. And that's why I'm saying it's syncretic, because it's using all of these different sources, like a modernist teacher as well as a very historical reference from the land, but not necessarily ethnically related in any way to what Turkish nationalism is claiming to be related to, and putting those things together. That's why I'm saying, even though they're looking for this synthesis, this marriage of these two languages, it never quite coalesces, and they all have different reference points. Like Bedirami is looking at Matisse, obviously, but he's also looking at Roman mosaics that is being excavated in Anatolia at the same time. So it has all these different sources that it's taking from. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%.
To follow up on that, sorry, I can't remember the name of the art historians who were writing around 1910, 15 in Germany, and positing that there was truly an ethnic difference to the Hittite history. So it's a generation where it's maybe 2 generations later that's picking up that argument and looking for that ethnic difference that is using the term copying to dismiss the, okay.
Yeah, exactly.
The modernity that before people would have been happy to have, just say it's new, it's borrowed, it's just not what we were doing. Okay.
Thank you very much. Yeah, you mentioned the term mimicry, and it passed very quickly. Can we go back to it and maybe tell us more how you use it? Because we've read Homi Bhabha, right? So does mimicry at any point challenge or disrupt, quote unquote, the original?
Well, yeah, I mean, in her book, Ottoman Painting, Wendy Shaw actually does use the word mimicry and uses it referring to Homi Bhabha. But I don't feel as comfortable applying a post-colonial term to a non-post-colonial context as much. I think there are different words you can use for different non-Western artistic positions, and I always use mimicry in a list.
Yes.
I never really stick to it myself. because I don't feel comfortable, and I want to acknowledge as one of the modes people have detected to be used by the non-Western artist or writer, because I know that it's one of the strategies. I do say it's a mimetic episteme because they're copying or emulating or using all of these tactics, but I think what Homi Baba is talking about is a specific case, so I didn't want to make this larger claim for the Turkish artist, because there's so many arguments, as I'm sure gets talked about here, as the Ottoman identity as the colonizer. So I feel uncomfortable using a post-colonial term for an Ottoman or a Turkish artist, if that makes sense.
But look, and the painting that you were showing, is there an instance of mimicry that you can point to, or not at all?
I never thought about it like formally in that way.
All right, thank you.
I want to ask, here in the region, we are suffering or facing many challenges and the crises, different type, economic, political, and environmental. How, as art historian, curator, negotiate with these challenges?
Very tough question. I think I look to artists to see what they're doing. I mean, I have this advantage, right? I'm not only an art historian, I also work as a curator with contemporary artists. So the last 2 years I spent in Abu Dhabi, and it's slightly different than the Turkish context in that there are really lines drawn in terms of what you can and cannot say, and be critical versus not be critical, protest versus not being able to protest. And artists seem to find ways to do it anyway, covertly or in a tongue-in-cheek way or using humor. I think I look to them for clues as for survival tactics.
Duygu, I'll try to come back to Walid's idea with mimicry a little more. So I'm also thinking, I'm familiar with Denise Nev's work about the Julian Academy, and that, that was a...
Deniz Artun.
Deniz Artun, thank you.
Yeah.
Gallery Nev.
Yes.
Yes, okay. And I mean, are we certain that nobody, that was a government mission sending students there, right, to the Julian Academy, but are we certain there was no other training anywhere else? Because, and the reason I'm asking, like, were there people sent to Germany, were people sent to Italy, and the reason I'm asking this is because the French, even though they didn't get to colonize the area, the Turks, they took away some land and did some pretty undignifying things.
Yeah.
So, and if all the references that people were objecting to were these French teachers, maybe there was something specific about the French.
Okay, that's interesting. Well, the first generation of the Ottoman painters that I talked about, the 1914 generation, they were the ones that were sent to France. And the ultimate goal was to go to the École des Beaux-Arts. The Julian was, Académie Julian was kind of a stop for them to get into the academy. So if they were not ready, because they didn't have nude models, right? So they couldn't practice from the female figure or the male figure directly when they were in the empire. They actually convinced like a street dancer to come into the studio one day, and Osman Hamdi got really mad at them and said, you have to send this person away. I'm already under so much scrutiny. Like, wait until you get to Paris, you can do all this, he says. but they're not ready for École des Beaux-Arts completely. So that's why the Julian is a pit stop. But they have to, like Osman Hamdi wants them to go to the official school. What changes with the second generation that I'm talking about is they're not required to go to the official school. It's much looser, and they're not required to go to Paris either. Some of them go to Munich. It depends on what they hear from other people. They basically follow their friends. Some of the engineers are going to Munich, and they hear that there's Hans Hofmann, who's also very good. A few of them go to Hans Hofmann's studio. Hale Asaf goes to Berlin to train. Mihri is in Berlin for a while to train. So it's not as prescribed for the generation that goes after the Republic, like the generations funded by the Republic. And the 1914 painters are not accused of copying in the same way. They're just accused of bringing a belated movement back to the empire. I don't know if it's a French, like a hostility towards the French. And that in that booklet by Hilmi Ziya Ülken, it's actually other examples as well. But this was the really juicy story to follow, basically, because I could find so much about it that I went for. But it wasn't strictly French.
On this, sorry, you're making me think of things. So the early 1950s is also a time, I may be getting the dates wrong, but of like ascendant Turkish nationalism. There's a war over Cyprus. I've seen this Netflix show, The Club.
Yes.
Which seems to take place around the time, the early 50s, and there's the war, there's violence against minorities. There seems to be a kind of sweaty nationalism. I wonder if it's expressed in these accusations from these younger painters who are saying these guys are imitating French artists rather than doing something original, and they want to do something original, distinctly Turkish. And I wonder if there's a relationship or not, maybe not.
There's a shift in the way nationalism is perceived. Definitely for the Ottoman painter, nationalism was a different thing. And then for the Republicans, let's say the early Turkish Republicans, nationalism is another thing. The ethnic strife happens in 1955. So I'm talking about 1951. It hasn't happened yet. The September 5-6 events is 1955. That hasn't happened yet. Maybe there's like brewing sentiments, but it's also the moment. The way I relate to it is because 1951 is the reopening of the painting museum after its closure in 1938. So I think this is why the copy problem comes to the surface again, but also the younger painters are frustrated that these guys are not leaving. Like they're occupying these positions and they're not letting the assistants take over studios and teach and try on abstraction, because they're abstract painters who do the accusations against these guys. So there might be a shifting sense of nationalism, but I think it's more of a power move.
Yeah.
I think it's more personal.
One more question?
Yeah.
Sorry, go back to mimicry. So it's more like a comment than a question. So I remember a passage in Kirsten's book where she tells us that the French colonial authorities refused repeatedly requests from local artist intellectuals to establish an art school in Beirut, and which did not happen until after the independence. And the argument was that the French were against allowing the natives, the locals, to learn how to paint like the French. In other words, they didn't want the locals to copy, right? Because it would be an embarrassment for the French.
If they became good copyists.
Well,
Or
so it seems like in the presence of like the castrating colonial father, the copy is mimicry, inevitably. And I'm wondering if in late Ottoman, early Turkish Republic, the absence of an obvious colonizer, the copy doesn't play that role, cannot be mimicry. Is that, am I following a bit?
you're doing my job for me. Thank you. Yeah, I think there's something there that it's not the same kind of hostile relationship. There's this internalized logic of not being sufficient, but also loving the French example too much. I do talk about it in the dissertation. I call it the anxiety of, like, I'm borrowing a term obviously, but I say it's an anxiety of influence. Like, they love it, but they also kind of want to be rid of it at the same time. But it's not in the way that you would hate the colonizer, but more like you would hate your teacher and want to be better than them. I think it's that kind of dynamic.
It's a diluted anxiety of influence.
I mean, there already was an école. There was a training system in the Ottoman,
Yeah.
right? Or
Yeah.
in the 1920s. Sorry, so Turkey, in the Turkish Republic, based on the École des Beaux-Arts, with the
Osman
same,
Hamdi's school, yeah.
Right.
Late 18.
which was
90s.
one of the things that the people here use to say, why can't we have that? It'd be very easy to do. It's very easy to have one of these. Well, yeah.
So the Sanaya, you would be studying something like that?
No, I mean, in Istanbul, there was an École des Beaux-Arts, right? And but when Sanaya was set up, wait, I'm going to get all confused now. 1907 is when Sanaya is set up. And they I can't remember. I wrote about it. It's in my book.
That's why you write.
Exactly. Actually, I don't know exactly the curriculum they had there. There was drawing.
My question is,
but I
why don't
believe it
they
was
go
more
to
like the
Istanbul to
military
study?
academy.
Why don't they go to Istanbul to study?
Some did. Some did go to Istanbul to study, but they went. You mean to the École des Beaux-Arts?
To Sanayi Nefise Mektebi.
I mean, no, Octavian left. Okay. Some did. I think they're not remembered in the histories anymore
Yeah.
here because they become they're not the right kind of Lebanese to make the new nation. The story that gets told is that the ones who really excelled, who'd been in, but they usually said to have been at the military academy, not at the Sana'i Nafisi. They did really well, and that they had to leave because the chronology gets really screwy because this is said to be in the 30s. This is being remembered in the 40s and being attributed to pre-20s, but it doesn't really make sense to me. So we have a big gap that we want to get our students interested in studying, I think, no?
Do you think the young artists here were they aware that they don't want to go to Istanbul because they don't want to study to copy copies? They want to go supposedly to the original. Was that?
I don't know.
Wait, the young artists here in the 1920s? And yeah, no, they're not. I mean, to go to Turkey would that have been okay to even do? I mean,
I think there's one more question.
It's not a question, it's a curiosity.
Okay.
The conversation we're having. Yesterday I read an article. Oh, it's okay. For Tongo.
Gizem Tongo.
Yeah, about the Shishli exhibition.
Yeah.
They say that the material. Oh, sorry. It says that the material was actually acquired from Germany, and that materially painting had such a embedded relationship with Germany and Austria. There was kind of like this trans-imperial production of art material, and later it was exhibited in Vienna, some of these works.
Yeah, that's
in
because
1918.
Ottoman Empire and Germany were allies.
Yes.
I mean,
So,
it was a war propaganda effort.
Yeah.
And yeah, the material is hard to obtain in Istanbul, and it's provided for this studio. And it's actually the first time that for the representation of the Ottoman Empire abroad, because they have participated in international exhibitions before as an empire, but it's the first time that the minorities, like if you're an Armenian painter or a Greek painter, it's the first time they're kept out. That's the most important part of Gizem's article, in which, but it's not a German influence in that way. It's like a wartime effort of let's bring our nations together through art.
I was just curious if that could be a reason why not a lot of art students were drawn to go to the center of the empire to learn art. And I think maybe there was an impact like of financial means and material means and so on.
Okay.
And also what that relationship, was there influence from, for example, German, Austrian aesthetics like there was from France? So also that relationship.
Yeah,
how it
there's an
impacted-
article by another Turkish scholar about the German influence on Ottoman. There was a Munich exhibition, so there were a lot of these exhibitions that were opening between Munich, Vienna, and Istanbul at the time, because it's trying to follow the political relations. So they were exposed to a lot of German art. They actually, I think the first Impressionist paintings that they see are German Impressionists. So not the original Impressionists, but the German Impressionists that get exhibited in Istanbul.
And when is that?
Hmm?
And when is that?
I think 1910.
Any other questions? It's now or never, Joseph.
Hi, thanks very much. I have a quick question about this phrase you used in your talk, mimetic episteme. Partly because like this strikes me as like there's some Aristotelianism hanging around in the background of this, where like he talks about how mimesis is partly about it's about learning, it's about imitation to learn, right? And so it's about knowledge. And so to accuse someone of copying isn't to accuse them of just imitating, it's to accuse them of imitating without information.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? And so I feel like this thing where the teachers are getting in the way, seemingly, might be relevant. Anyway, and so I'm curious how this Foucaultian thing, right? Word you've borrowed and where you're going with that. Like, I want to hear more about it.
Yeah, I mean,
Sounds great.
I was borrowing episteme from Foucault, obviously, but mimesis I was thinking about, but maybe I didn't even footnote it that way in my dissertation. I should do so in the book. And I should talk about why it's not Homi Bhabha's mimicry. Yeah, there's something there that I should think more about, but I probably haven't given it enough thought, and it's being picked up on, which is good. Thank you.
Thank you, Duygu. You've given us so much to think about
Thank you.
tonight. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.